My name is Muina Mahmood. I'm Community Engagement and Partnership Specialist at the Illinois Answers Project. During today's discussion, we'll be talking about Chicago's building safety record, what other cities are doing to fix unsafe housing conditions, Chicago renter rights, and what you need to know as a tenant, and also what you can personally do to advocate for safer housing in Chicago. Today's event is hosted by the Illinois Answers Project. And if you aren't familiar with us, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit news source working every day to uncover waste and wrongdoing in government, hold public officials accountable, and lift up solutions to Illinois' most pressing problems. We're published by the Better Government Association, who's been fighting for greater government transparency and accountability for a century now. You can check out the Illinois Answers most recent work at the link in the chat. Today, we're so lucky to be joined by Arieh Venick, who's a community organizer for the Metropolitan Tenants organization, as well as Alex Nitkin, who's one of our reporters here at the Illinois Answers Project. I'll give a full introduction of Arieh in a moment, but first, let me give you the agenda for today's discussion. Alex and Arieh will discuss Alex's recent reporting, the Healthy Homes Ordinance, and what the city is doing to keep tenants safe, and what renters need to know in Chicago. Then we're going to leave some time at the end for a Q&A at the end of discussion. We ask that you stay muted throughout the session, but please feel free to type in any questions you have into the chat at any time, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end. And we plan to end promptly at 7 p.m. Also, just another heads up that we'll be recording this discussion. We'll share the recording afterwards with you in case you aren't able to stay for the whole hour. And then now to introduce Arieh. So Arieh Venick has been organizing with MTO since the beginning of this year. Before joining MTO, Arieh worked with his neighbors in the Albany Park Organizing Committee to unionize tenants in his community. Through MTO, Arieh has unionized tenants in Pilsen, Logan Square, Albany Park, Edgewater, Beverly, and Roseland. His work is motivated by a strong belief that tenant organizing is the best and most successful way to capture the social imagination of working people to envision and actualize a new world. When he's not organizing, he likes to dance to techno music and ride his bike, which sounds very fun. Thank you for taking time away from that today to join us. And thank you again for hopping on this discussion with us. And I'll go ahead and pass over to Alex, who will be leading us for the next hour.
Thank you, Mumina. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. And I'm really glad that everyone has come out to be a part of this conversation about building safety, which is not always the sort of sexiest political topic or at the top of people's minds when they talk about what government is and should be. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's one of those things that in the back of our minds, we kind of just assume that none of us are someone is assuring that we're not living in an unsafe building, in a building that puts us in danger. So that's part of what we have been trying to shed light on and bring more of a public understanding to at the BGA, now Illinois Answers Project, for a number of years. So first, I just want to give a little bit of background on our reporting. We'll talk about how where Arieh sort of fit into that reporting, and then pass it over to him to talk about some kind of practical takeaways from it. And in terms of practical takeaways, I think of it in terms of, number one, sort of what tenants can do in practical terms when they find themselves in situations where they think they're paying to live in an unsafe building and trying to get their landlord to do something about it. And then number two, on kind of a wider community level, what the city of Chicago, state of Illinois, or neighborhoods, wards can do to try to organize to create a better system or build a better system where buildings will be safer, where government will ensure that buildings are safer. So this sort of streak of reporting goes back a number of years to my colleague at VGA, Madison Hopkins, who worked with Cecilia Reyes at the Tribune for this really, in-depth, long-running series called The Failures Before the Fires that folks may remember. And you can, I'm gonna drop the link to all of our fires reporting that was sort of aggregated together. They did some really phenomenal work and found that over the course of, they pulled together like 5 years worth of building data, fire department data, through on one calls, and found dozens and dozens of examples of fatal fires with tragic, losses of life, in which the city had somehow previously known that there were unsafe conditions in those buildings and did not act. And what that was really getting at was not just that, individual actors in that situation were neglectful necessarily, but that the Department of Buildings system is really not built in large part to prevent tragedies, to ensure that people's buildings are safe. It's a very reactive system. It relies on individual complaints. It relies on tenants to complain about their landlords publicly, which could put them in danger of retaliation. And ultimately, I continued that reporting also with Adriana Perez and Kelly Duncan. Adriana Perez of the Tribune and Kelly Duncan here at BGA sort of picked up the baton earlier this year and showed that, hey, this is still an issue. It's still happening, that, people dying in fires are sort of the most horrifying consequence of what can happen when buildings are left unsafe, but that there are many, many, many more examples of people who are just dealing with the day-to-day frustrations and indignities of, mold, rodents, water damage, things like that. So over the course of this year at Illinois Answers, what we've been trying to do is shift our mode of reporting a little bit more toward, because, at this point, I'm sure the Department of Buildings is sick of us just saying like, hey, this is bad, it's not working. So we've been trying to implement this practice of solutions journalism and say, okay, what are other cities doing to actually modernize their building safety regimens, their building safety systems in a way that makes sense? What are people proposing to do in Chicago? What are folks trying to do? That's how we ended up going to Denver and found they have Denver is one of many cities that is finding a way to sort of move the ball forward on this issue. There are different cities that are doing it in different ways. Minneapolis has a really sophisticated system with different sort of tiered levels of how often you get inspected. Los Angeles built out a system like this that has been praised for, really getting landlords to act. Going back to the 90s, I actually went to Denver, which is sort of the most recent city to actually try to put something like this into practice. They are licensing private third-party inspectors to do inspections and then help those property managers get registered, to get licensed with the city of Denver. So I would encourage you to read the story if you haven't. It is, there are advantages and drawbacks to that. It's sort of a new program. It's been slow. It's had all kinds of speed bumps, but we went there to basically show like, hey, this kind of thing is possible. If the political will is there, cities can really invest in the, energy and money and time into really making this happen and investing in building safety in the long term. And so as a part two, we took a little bit of a closer look at Chicago and some of the organizing work that's being done in Chicago to try to advance some of those similar kind of parallel goals here toward this ultimate goal of someday having a system in which the city has inspectors going out on a regular basis proactively inspecting buildings to make sure that they're all safe, and on a sort of more fundamental level, just making sure that there is some kind of public central exhaustive database of who owns what building where. And I talked to Arieh about that in the piece, talked to some other organizers, talked to folks in Denver and folks who study this nationally. And as part of the reporting on that, we went to this building in Edgewater called the Edison that's right across from the Marianos at Sheridan and Foster. If you've ever been there, it has had some issues, and Arieh has been with MTO organizing some of the tenants there. And we felt that that was sort of an example of how difficult it can be to really get the city to step in under the current system and do something about unsafe buildings. And so this is where, Arieh, I want to bring you in. And first of all, just to thank you again for joining us and sort of sharing your expertise and knowledge with us about this and sharing your experience. Can you start off just by telling me a little bit about Metropolitan Tenants Organization, what you do there, and then ultimately sort of how that led you to the Edison at 5200 North Sheridan.
Absolutely. So just want to start off by saying I'm really happy to be here. Alex, thank you for doing your great reporting. Everybody at the Illinois Answers Project for just doing some really great reporting on, like you said, maybe some of not the sexiest issues facing our city, but really important stuff. And so succinctly, what MTO does, Metropolitan Tenants Organization does, is educate, empower, and organize. And so the way we do that is we run four programs, sorry. We have our hotline, which takes calls from across the city, gives tenants rights, navigation, and advice to folks reaching out to us. We run our eviction protection program, which helps folks navigate active eviction processes. So if you're going through an eviction process, to reach out to us, we can triage with you, get you legal support. There is the Healthy Homes program, which is sort of like our organizing effort to bolster our flagship ordinance, which is the Chicago Healthy Homes Ordinance, which Alex has been talking a little bit about with the registry and cyclical inspections. And then there's the organizing program, which I work for, as well as one other organizer. And so we go across the city, addressing tenant crises. Parallel to these programs, we support sort of this constellation of tenant ordinances in the city: Just Cause, Lift the Ban, and obviously the Chicago Healthy Homes Ordinance. We know, just like you said, Alex, that it's really difficult sometimes for tenants to begin to struggle and advance and advocate for their rights, A, because there's a lack of knowledge, and B, because it puts the spotlight on you. You need to be loud, you need to make noise, and some tenants are petrified of retaliation because they don't know that they're protected to organize and what steps to take. And so that leads me to how I got into it with the Edison. So we sort of the river that flows through MTO is the hotline. And so we got a call from the hotline. They said, hey, there's these really horrible issues in our building, and people are ready to organize here. And so what happens when we get a call like that? What happened in the case of the Edison is one of the organizers reached out. It was me this time. I reached out to our tenant contact there. I said, hey, listen, tell me about what's going on. Talk to them, go through some organizing conversations with them, make sure that they're activated, ready to know, what it's going to take really to organize, right? It's not a simple process. It is involved. It's not a silver bullet. There are challenges. So we inoculate them, we prepare them, and then we ask them to start getting together an initial meeting. We hold an initial meeting, learn what the issues are, and to begin to construct a campaign around those demands. And so that's what happened at the Edison. We have a really strong belief at MTO, and I have a personally strong belief that we need to develop tenants unions in this city as a way to build a tenants movement. We talked about laws, we talked about CHO, we talked about all these things. The question is, the question that it begs is, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And in this case, the chicken would be a strong tenants movement, and the egg would be strong tenant ordinances. And so from where I sit and from the experience and from where we sit at MTO, we know that we need to build a strong tenants movement through unionizing tenants, proactive organization, education, so that there is the political will and the impetus to push these ordinances through city council.
Yeah, thanks for that. So talking about it from in terms of the pipeline or the process of how you get from a complaint to using tenants unions or organizing to do something about it. So say I, have a leak in my ceiling, I'm renting, and every time it rains, it sounds like something that one of the tenants at that building described to me. Say I have a leak in my ceiling, every time it rains, it gets, wet or something like that. I reach out to my landlord is not doing anything about it, and I feel kind of stuck. What are my options at that point as a renter? What would you sort of advise someone in my position, if that were happening, to start doing in order to try to, improve my situation?
Absolutely. So, the solution The power of tenant organizing is people power, is building that power. And the way we build that is through connections. And the way that we get those connections is by developing relationships with our neighbors. And it really is just as simple as going to your neighbors and talking to them, having a conversation, learning what their issues are. Because if you're having a problem in your apartment and your landlord is not responding to you, odds are they're doing the same thing to your neighbor. You know, the landlords typically treat tenants the same. You know, you have a decent landlord or you got a problematic landlord. And if you have a problematic landlord, coming to them on an individual level, just like you described, typically doesn't work. Power only concedes to power. And so the way we build that power is by networking, building those relationships. I just talked to several tenants today who are having problems in their building. What I told them is, hey, listen, I know it can be challenging. I know it can be scary. We live in an atomized society where people are afraid or nervous sometimes to talk to their neighbors, but you got to go find your neighbors, passing them in the hall, knock on their door and introduce yourself and say, hey, my name's Arieh. I live down in Unit B. I've been having these issues and I just wanted to come and talk to you about your experience living here. You know, how long have you lived here? What are some of the problems? I've got those same problems too. You know, I'm sick and tired of this. You know, whose responsibility is it to fix these issues? It's not you or me, it's the landlord. So talking with people, learning their problems, making sure to present them with a realistic vision, right? We can come together and we can fight, but just like I said before, it's not a silver bullet. We don't want to sell people a pipe dream. We want to sell them the reality that things are bad. The only way that they're going to get better is through organizing, and the only way to organize is to come together. And so reaching out to your neighbors, getting their numbers, sitting down in a meeting saying, hey, these are our issues. These are our problems. What are our demands? What do we want to see happen? Okay, these are the demands that we've got. Let's get it down on pen and paper. By formalizing a tenants union, by making it clear and visible that you're organizing, you get protections under the law here in Chicago under the RLTO, the Residential Landlord Tenant Ordinance. So the first step is to take those demands, give yourself a powerful name, the Edison Tenants Association, the Fair Tenants Union, you know, the whatever you may be. That's a fun part. One of the few really fun and creative parts of tenant ordinance. You give yourself a name, you put those demands in a letter, and you say, hey, landlord Joe Schmo, we're looking to meet and talk about it. Organizing is a step-by-step, it's incremental. And so you start with a letter, odds are they're going to ignore you. After the letter doesn't work, start making these 3-in-1 requests. You start formalizing, writing email after email, documenting every issue, putting it in with the city, reaching out to your alderman, making sure you're continuing to build power in the city, reaching out to community organizations to let them know what's going on and muster their support for you. You write another letter. You say, you've ignored us. We want to meet. What's going on? They don't respond. Let's escalate. It's a step-by-step. It's called a diversity of tactics and escalating. So you never play your trump card first. You take one step at a time. If they're not responding to letters, you show up at their office. If they blow you off, you show up at their house. You protest. If they blow you off, you launch a social media campaign. You expose them for what they're doing. If that doesn't get them to move, you go to the press. And we were just talking about social pressure tactics. There's also legal tactics that we can take advantage of depending on the severity of the conditions of the building. So it's understanding the diversity of tactics, taking one step at a time, but at the very base of organizing, it is relationship building, trust, and solidarity. There's no union, tenants union, labor union that can exist without having a vested interest and some form of trust and solidarity with the folks that you're working with. So it's at the very core relationship building, escalating tactics, step-by-step, documentation, and applying pressure.
I want to pause here real quick just to make sure that folks know they can ask questions in the chat. We're going to probably take another 15 or 20 minutes just talking, and then we'll be happy to answer folks' questions. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out with any just thoughts or opinions or whatever. We want to make this an open conversation. So thank you for laying out that whole sequence. It's a really interesting and sort of like repeatable kind of playbook. It seems like one that has been successful in a lot of places and done in a lot of places. There was one step that you mentioned almost sort of like as an afterthought, which was file 311 requests, right? And it's sort of like in a perfect world or in a system that worked better, maybe there would be no entire list of organizing actions. It would just be you reach out to the city, you file a 311 request, and then the city sends an inspector the next day. They, bury the landlord in tickets or, force them into action somehow. Why doesn't it work like that in Chicago? And how does it work in your experience with filing 311 requests? Filing a 311 request, in other words, a complaint to the Department of Buildings saying, hey, we're having this issue, you need to come check it out.
Sure. So let's clarify this a little bit. At the beginning of the process, I will always tell tenants to immediately file a 311 request as a way to document officially what is going on. The backup with the Department of Buildings is insane. It can take months for an inspector to come to your building, even if it's in crisis levels. When there's issues of essential services shut off, heat, water, electricity, and they get multiple complaints, it can be expedited a little bit. But the way that it works here in Chicago, the real lived experience of tenants living in problem buildings is that I make a 311 request. I have no idea the status of that request. I don't know when the inspector is going to come. And if they do come, if they can even get into the building. Many of the violations that we see here in Chicago are for structural or exterior violations, because that's the only thing that the inspectors can get into. If they show up at the building, they'll tell the landlord they're coming. They won't tell the tenants oftentimes. Tenants have no idea. So they'll tell the landlord might not be there to let them in. And they surely won't be going into some of the problem units. And so, they'll document structural issues, issues with the edifice of the building, whatever it is, and then leave the inside of the building in absolutely horrific condition and undocumented. And so not only is there this slow rollout of services to tenants in crisis, the results of these inspections often do not come up with anything that's actually going to materially benefit the tenant in terms of their unit or a common space within the building. And so, this system is completely broken. One thing that I will tell everybody listening is that 311, not a great, it's a system that helps you document. It's the system that we have now. We hope to change that moving forward to something more robust and where there's cyclical inspections. But if you have a crisis in your building, you're dealing with a problem landlord, you're getting no relief, and you put in 311 requests and nothing is happening, go to your alder person. Alder people have privileges to dispatch inspectors based on just aldermanic privilege. And so if your building is in crisis and you're not getting anywhere, get everybody together in your building who's upset, go to your alderman's office and say, hey, we are in crisis here. You got to send an inspector out, and put them to task to do that. They are an elected official. You are their constituents. And if they want to get reelected, they've got to provide services to the community. And so utilize the power that you have as a constituent to put pressure on elected officials to utilize aldermanic privilege to circumvent the issues that are present with the 311 process as it exists.
Yeah, so I want to just stop and provide a little bit of context on this issue of the city's responsiveness or lack of responsiveness on 311 complaints. I think that a lot of our understanding of this issue dates back to this really revelatory moment in this sort of story in 2018 when the city's inspector general published this report on after having spent months following around building inspectors, kind of auditing the Department of Buildings, and finding that even though there was a statutory requirement that all inspections be answered within 60 days, which first of all is you think a very long kind of deadline, we're just blowing off, they were missing that deadline. A lot of them were just getting buried in this just huge pile, this morass of bureaucratic paperwork, and they just weren't getting inspected at all. There's a massive backlog. The inspectors themselves are completely overwhelmed. They're dealing with antiquated technology, a disorganized system, and so many of these slip through the cracks. And the city and the Department of Buildings, specifically their response to that, to learning that they were routinely violating this requirement to hit that deadline for doing inspections within a certain time period, the city then went into the ordinance and said, okay, we'll just eliminate that requirement then. So then we, problem solved. They weren't breaking the rule anymore because they got rid of the rule. So that has really been, there hasn't really been any substantive change since then. We've been showing how, just my own experience diving through all of these 311 and Department of Buildings records, very, very often, just like you said, Ari, the note is, inspector was dispatched, no one was home, door was locked, and then that's just sort of the dead end. We don't really know what happened after that. Or very often, a violation was logged and then the matter is closed without really any explanation, or we don't really understand how it happened, but just because there is so much pressure to sort of like get each of these things off of their plates. So I think that's probably a good transition point to talk about sort of like what can be done about all of this. So can you tell me, you mentioned that Healthy Homes is one of the sort of planks of what MTO is all about. Can you just describe sort of the general motivation concept behind Healthy Homes, the Healthy Homes Ordinance, where it all came from and the need for it?
Sure. So it came from the situation that you have just described, right? Chicago tenants languishing in substandard housing without the ability to get relief. And, we hear from landlords all the time, oh, we've got these ordinances that are protecting tenants. We don't need anything new. But as you've just described, and we've just talked about, the onus of getting these protections and holding landlords accountable is put individually on a specific tenant. Tenants as an individual have very little power, and they are afraid of retaliation, afraid to speak up, and oftentimes sidelined just by the nature of the way that our system works. And so in response to this broken system, we've proposed Chicago Healthy Homes Ordinance, as the solution to that. And I'll break down some of the pillars of the Chicago Healthy Homes Ordinance. One is a landlord registry. Landlords disguise themselves in a veil of corporate LLCs and offshore whatever, and it makes it very, very difficult to identify who your landlord is. If I would challenge all of our listeners to go onto the Cook County Recorder of Deeds website and look up who their landlord is, it's probably 123 LLC Beaver Street. It's completely obfuscated or mystified for the tenant. So we want to get a landlord registry so we know who we're dealing with. We know what buildings are registered as rental buildings and who owns that buildings. The main owner must be identified. And there are exceptions, right, for small landlords, live-in landlords under 6 units, for public housing. Associated with this registry is also a fee to help fund the inspections and basically execution of the ordinance. And so there's this registry where all the landlords can be found, and then the inspection requirement. So under the statute or the ordinance as it stands now, the expectation or the average cyclical inspection timeline is every 5 years. I know that might seem like a long time, but just as we've talked about, it could take 5 years for your 311 complaint to get answered. And so this is every year, even if your landlord is perfect, no 311 complaints, no issues, an inspector will come to your building every 5 years to make sure everything is up to snuff. And for landlords that are problematic, high levels of violations, they could go down to inspections every year. It's dependent on the severity of the conditions in the building. And so, let's just be very clear. This is to focus on healthy homes issues, mold, water damage, pests, to make sure that the standard of habitability, which is the implicit agreement that every tenant and landlord enter into, whether it's a written lease or an oral lease, the standard of habitability has to be met. And if you're living in an apartment where you've got Mickey Mouse running around and, roaches everywhere and mushrooms growing out of your wall, in no world is that meeting that standard of habitability. And so this ordinance is meant to compel landlords to meet that standard of habitability consistently, and not just have the structural issues be the highlight of whatever's going on. We need relief for what's going on inside of these buildings. It's not about the building being an eyesore. Obviously, we want to make sure buildings aren't falling down, not to, minimize the issue of structural violations, but we need to get inside. We need to make sure things look good, and we need to make sure that landlords are held accountable to these repairs.
And just to be clear, this is not, we're talking about inspections for like, you have the wrong kind of copper in your hinge, or like the porch is 6 inches to the left of what your zoning variance allows, that kind of thing. This is like a basic checklist for safety standards. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying you're absolutely right. These inspections are not meant to like dock you on every single thing. This is to make sure to go in that, just like I said, make sure there aren't rats running around, mold growing out of the floors, to just uphold the basic standards of habitability in residential housing in Chicago.
Yeah, I thought that one of the really interesting things about the ordinance is that it lays out these 3 categories of violations. I don't remember what the terms are off the top of my head, but basically it's like super dangerous conditions that like people need to get out of here, kind of like not very, somewhat less dangerous conditions, and then a kind of a nuisance condition, something like, well, I don't know, something a little bit less serious. So, and there are sort of different consequences that are meted out for each of them. I think that is the model that we're starting to see rolled out with these kind of basic life safety inspections in other cities, including Denver. Each of these inspectors is given like a 2-page sheet of just like the absolute basics of life safety. Are there smoke detectors? Is there a boiler that works? Is it free of mold as far as you could tell? Just to sort of check through, and then each inspection is done in like 10 minutes or less. And what's interesting about the Chicago inspections is that I feel like in my just general reporting on the city of Chicago and the way the processes work, so much of it is kind of subjective and qualitative and relationship based, and like based on the individual situation. A lot of it is just sort of like, even talking about aldermanic privilege, like, has your alderman called the right person? Like, have you talked to the right people? Have you made the right relationships? And I think that really feeds into the building inspection process. There's this really great book that came out last year that helped us tremendously with our reporting, called Stacked Decks, by a Northwestern sociologist named Robin Bartram, where she actually shadowed city building inspectors for I think a year, and basically found that inspectors are giving a huge amount of leeway based on, what kind of landlord they think they're dealing with, and really being kind of tailoring each inspection to each individual situation, which, honestly, the buildings department kind of defends and says like, hey, we trust the building inspectors. But when you have that wide latitude for them to make individual decisions among of any of the some 11,000 different violations that they can impose if they want to, there are so many opportunities for either sort of favoritism or discrimination to creep in. And so many of the experts that we've talked to who study this on the national level say it's really important to remove all of those variables for like who the inspector knows or how they're feeling on a certain day, or what gut intuition they have, and standardize it as much as possible with things like proactive inspections to make sure that everyone is undergoing the same thing. Because there is this sort of saying that like, and a reason why landlords are kind of terrified of inspectors, and many are against this ordinance, is like, well, if an inspector comes into my building and they want to find a violation, they probably could, right? Like, if they were going just by the Chicago building code under the way it is now, they could find some minute thing. But what's interesting about ordinances like Healthy Homes is it's going down to the basics and just coming up with that really basic checklist of life safety things. Before we open it up to questions, I want to go back to, speaking of kind of the opposition and what folks in the real estate industry have said about this. You had mentioned that landlords or tenants, especially in Chicago, have a lot of recourse under the Residential Landlord Tenants Organization, or excuse me, the Residential Landlord Tenant Ordinance, the RLTO. This, interestingly, is really, I think, a lot of the response that we've gotten from landlords from this reporting is, hey, we're already dealing with the RLTO where tenants or their lawyers can just sort of like sue us over minute things, and they already have so many things in their corner. The RLTO is so tilted toward landlords more than it is, tilted toward in favor of tenants more than most ordinances are in other cities. So like, isn't that enough? Like, can't you just like leave us alone? I wonder what your response is to that sort of line of argument.
Absolutely. I love debating landlord stands just because I think that is completely incorrect, right? Let's do a history lesson. When the RLTO was being passed through the city council, landlords said the exact same thing. They said, hey, we're good guys. We take care of tenants. Tenants have rights. We don't need this. No landlord is going to embrace higher scrutiny or accountability, but let's break it down. So the RLTO exists, tenants do have recourse, but just as we described before with the current system, especially with inspections and healthy homes issues, it's individualized to the tenant. There is no structural, cyclical, or systemic institution or ordinance monitoring the standard of these buildings. And so it is up for a tenant to say, oh, I'm going to make these complaints. I'm going to make noise. And not only does that put a huge onus on somebody who is working, maybe they're disabled, maybe they're going through crisis, maybe they're a single mother, they have a whole life. They shouldn't be consumed with trying to fight for the dignity of their housing. So not only is it individualizing the work of fighting for the dignity of housing to the tenant, it puts a target on their back. The landlord can know who made the complaint, especially if they're being vocal about it. If you go to your landlord and say, I need this fixed, they don't fix it, and then the 311 complaint comes in, they know what's going on. They can see when it comes in. And so it puts a target on the tenant's back. And let's also be real. The RLTO exists, but many aspects of it are unenforced. I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but enforcement here in Chicago is pitiful. And so we're asking for tenants to not only advocate for themselves, but be the ones who enforce these tenant protections. And so, what we're really trying to do is change the law so that landlords are the ones being monitored and forced to address these problems as they come up with these regular inspections, and not waiting until they become these massive, expensive, and sometimes insurmountable structural environmental issues in the homes. And I'll pose a question, right? Or I'll paint you a picture. Anybody who owns a home would want to do regular repairs on the home so that it doesn't turn into, a rat infested, horrific place to be. So why wouldn't a landlord want to regularly invest in their property and also provide quality housing? This will not only save them money in the long term, but also just make it an easier job for them. This will not cost them more money because it's simply addressing the issues as they come up rather than waiting until they're in crisis. Landlords will complain no matter what. They want to preserve the status quo. And let's think about it. What other industry is completely unregulated? When we go to a restaurant, there are safety inspectors. What other industry is completely unregulated, or regulation is put into the hands of those making money off of that industry? And so we can look to places like LA, Denver, Minneapolis, where they have similar laws. LA, it's been going on for 20 years. We don't, and landlords will say, oh, this will incur extra costs for us, the fees for the registry, the repairs, it'll be untenable. You guys are bullying us. But in LA, we don't see skyrocketing rents as a result to consistent repair. Let's be real. We live in a society, in an economy where it's a commodified housing market. Housing prices are driven by speculation, not by laws protecting tenants. And so, that, again, a whole nother conversation about gentrification, enforcement of laws. Can't cover it tonight, but that would be my answer to folks who say, hey, why would we want to do this? Things are all right. Tenants have all the rights. Simply not true. And, live one day in the shoes of a tenant, and you'll see that they aren't the big bullies they're made out to be by landlords.
Yeah, I think that what it's a really important point, I think, that you're getting at, that as much as the RLTO kind of lays out potential recourse, ultimately it's like it's putting it in the tenant's hands. It's recourse that they would have to act upon, as opposed to something that the city is doing of its own accord. So with that in mind, I want to encourage folks to put some questions in the chat. I see one person already has. Also, we got some folks submitted questions beforehand. So I want to dip into those just for a second. This is actually, I think, a good bridge from that conversation about RLTO. Someone asked, we were forced to move when our landlady died and her daughter raised the rent $600 per month. Why is this allowed?
Okay, so this exactly what you said, Alex. This goes to exactly what we were talking about. The RLTO is not this big baseball bat that tenants can wield and get away with anything, right? We live in a state where there is not only no rent control, there is a ban on rent control. And so what that means is that landlords can charge whatever they want. Rent gouging is not a crime here. There is no regulation on that. Your rent could go from $800 a month, given the appropriate notification of increase under the fair notice ordinance right now, it could be 60 days, 120 days. If you're month to month, your landlord could raise your rent by 100%. There's absolutely nothing to be done about it. As the law stands, right? You can organize, you can demand things, you can put public pressure on your landlord, but they're under no legal obligation to make these changes. And so, what I'd say is that first we need to lift the ban on rent control. And when we think about Chicago and Illinois, we love Governor Pritzker, but Governor Pritzker himself is a real estate mogul. We have people in power running things here in Illinois whose interests are not the same interests as the working tenants that they're representing. And so we need to push and demand that our rent control ban is lifted, and then we need to pass rent control ordinances. It is exceptionally undemocratic that landlords and vested landlord interests control our politics and deny folks here in Chicago, what should be a democratic privilege, a privilege of our democracy to decide whether or not we want rent control. And so I know that was a long answer, but the short answer is, why is this allowed? Because the law says it is. And at this point, we have no recourse until we overturn the ban and pass rent control measures.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's it, right? Why are they allowed to raise rent by $600? Is because no government or public body in the state of Illinois since 1997 is allowed to put any cap on raising rents by anyone. And also just some quick context on you briefly mentioned the fair notice for eviction and non-renewal ordinance. This was passed in, I think it was 2021. It was during COVID. There was all of these discussions coming to a head of how can we protect renters during COVID, and sort of the compromise that ended up getting passed was fair notice for eviction and non-renewal, which means that you have, depending on how long you have lived in your building, you have, I believe, is it between 60 and 120 days that your landlord must notify you if they're going to either try to evict you, or even if they're going to not renew your lease. I personally was in a situation a year ago where I wanted to renew in my building for another year, and my landlord was like, okay, that's nice, but actually I just sold the building, so you have a month and a half to get out. And I said, actually, under the ordinance, because I've lived here for 7 years, I have 120 days. So this is why we talk about it's important to know about these things, and so that you can sort of do self-enforcement if the city is not going to hold up its end. So here's another question that sort of gets at this. Okay, so how can renters get flooding and black mold eradication addressed in a timely way? Can rent be reduced until these issues are fixed? So this is really interesting because this brings up another question of sort of legal recourse under RLTO, under state law, city ordinance. And I would sort of paraphrase this question or add on, kind of broaden it to like, under what circumstances as a renter am I allowed to withhold rent legally?
Okay, so this is a big question, and I'm going to try and give you a concise response. And so flooding has been a huge highlighted issue in sort of the aftermath of the massive floods that we saw this summer with the torrential rains. And so let's be clear, under the RLTO subsect 5-12-10, so being very specific here.
Did you have that off the top of your head? You just knew that?
Alex, I prepared. I took some notes.
Nice.
But yes, that is, it is in the RLTO. You know, you can look it up. That is the subsection here. But if your building is affected by fire or flooding, you can have a couple recourses here to vacate the building immediately. There is no like process you have to go through. You tell the landlord there's been a fire, there's been a flood, I'm out of here. I'm terminating my lease. You're within your legal rights to do that. Or you can continue occupancy with reduced rent. Now, let's be very, 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 very specific about reducing rent. Many tenants will become, you know, just pushed over the edge by the conditions in their apartment and begin withholding rent. I would never stand in judgment of an individual like that. And I support tenants taking action and advocating for themselves. But withholding rent without the proper processes, following the proper protocols, can land you in a precarious situation and at risk of eviction. And so if you are to withhold rent in a general sense, there's two ways that you can do it depending on the conditions that you're experiencing. Let's say you have mold and you've reached out to your landlord, no response, they're not fixing it. You make that 311 call we talked about to make sure that it's on the city database. You make sure all of your communication to your landlord is written. You write them a letter. You send it priority mail before the 14th of the month, and you say, "Dear landlord XXX, my mold issue is unresolved. You have 14 days to repair this issue, or I will be reducing my rent by X%, as that is the diminished value of the apartment due to the issue that I'm experiencing." You have to give them 14 days to repair. The letter has to be sent before the 15th of the month so that they have 14 days to make that repair over the course of the month. If the repair is not made within that time period, you can reduce your rent by the percentage articulated in the message to your landlord for the following month. Let's say it's an essential services issue: gas, water, light, electric, plumbing. The timeline is shortened dramatically. So if you have an issue with any of those essential services, you do the same thing, write a letter, priority mail, so that there's tracking, so it can be verified that it's been delivered. This is important if it goes to court. You have tracking on that priority mail. You say the same thing: "Dear landlord XXX, my heat is out. I need relief within 24 hours. If you do not give me relief within 24 hours, you can pursue." It gives you a lot more leeway. And so I don't want to go into such detail because, you know, it can be individualized, but when it's an essential service issue, you know, we can see rent reductions up to 100% of the rent. You know, if your running water isn't working, why would you pay rent in an apartment? You know, the higher the amount you're withholding has to reflect the diminished value of the apartment. And so if you live a month without heat, you could say, I'm not going to pay rent this month. And, you know, pursuant to that letter, you would be within your legal right to do that. There's other things like you could, you know, take up residency in a hotel. You could, you know, buy heaters and expense that to your landlord. And so what I would say is that tenants do have the rights using specific protocols. If you have an issue with your essential services or non-repairs in your apartment, call MTO and we will advise you specifically on what you can do and connect you with legal resources to give you specific advice on how much you can, what is the advised amount to withhold based on the diminished value of your apartment. And just to close this conversation, for folks who have flooding damage as a result of these torrential rains, and your landlord is heaming and hawing about making repairs, you can go to them and talk to them about the FEMA money that has been made available to make repairs to apartment buildings. That was something that was recently, sort of released here in Chicago. And so I know that was a long answer, but yes, that would be my response to that. If you got issues, please reach out to MTO.
Yeah, no, that was an impressive amount of detail and yet also sufficiently concise. That was awesome. One of the things that I mean, yeah, it's really interesting that that level of sort of specificity, if you can reduce, if you can like calculate it, that you've the value has been taken off to that extent. This reminds me of like, we've been looking at all these other cities, and one of the most interesting and I think like innovative creative programs that we've seen is in LA. Or have you heard of the REAP program, the Rent Escrow Account Program? This is something that it's operated by the LA Department of Housing or whatever it's called out there. Yeah, LA Housing Department. That they could actually step in and say, first of all, that tenants are only required to pay a certain amount in rent. It can be 50 to 90% of their current rent, but that all of the rent that they do pay has to go into an escrow account that is controlled, under lock and key by the city, and that the landlord can only dip into to pay for repairs. So I just thought that was a really interesting, like, in this whole conversation of the balance of like, how do you sort of get property owners to improve or do repairs on a building without also setting up the, problematic like proposition of like raising rent. This is one really interesting way to actually like, that's within the realm of legal possibility to actually just get landlords to fix the issues. All right, absolute last thing I want to ask, just how can folks get more engaged in this issue on a citywide level? How can they either get more educated or get more activated or involved on building safety policy on the local and city and state level?
Totally. So, there's a constellation of tenant advocates, organizers, and, folks, working to change policy. Depends on what you want to do. You want to organize, there's, we're the only nonprofit in the state that specializes in organizing tenants and tenants' rights advocacy. There's other folks doing it. Many of them are volunteer. The Autonomous Tenants Union, one of the longest standing tenants' rights and organizing groups in the city, an amazing group to go to. They're involved in the Just Cause Coalition, many policy campaigns that they're involved in, and also on the ground tenant organizing, folks like the North Spalding Renters Association. If you live in a Lawrence Fishman building, hit those guys up. If you're listening, they do great organizing. The Hope Center on the South Side, Me Not We on the South Side, Unete in Pilsen on the West Side. I mean, there is just a plethora of on the ground organizations doing tenant organizing. If you are either having difficulty reaching them or need help and want to organize your building or learn how to organize, reach out to MTO. We do organize your trainings. We do know your rights trainings, and we will organize your building. If you can get your tenants together, we will work with you to organize. If you want to pursue policy change, come work with us. Reach out to us. We have our own policy that our flagship ordinance, the Chicago Healthy Homes Ordinance. We also are involved in almost every imaginable policy coalition in the city. The Chicago Housing Initiative Coalitions, the Just Cause Coalition, Lift the Ban. We've got our fingers in all of it. And so I would say reach out to us if you need help. We are happy to direct you. Call the hotline, talk to them. If you've got a problem, if you want to get connected, please send us an email, reach out. We want to work with motivated, ideological, and just anybody, any tenant who is in crisis or wants to see the situation for tenants get better in this city.
Well, Arieh, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time and for educating us on all of this. And thank you to everyone for being part of this discussion. And I'm going to kick it over to our awesome events coordinator, Saloni, to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ari and Alex, for this great discussion. I know you talked about a lot of things and answered a lot of questions, and it was really amazing to hear all the detail and everything. And again, we want to thank everybody who attended today. We're about to pop a post-event survey in the chat if you're able to fill it off before you log off today, just so that we continue to hold conversations like this and know how to improve going forward. And, we'll be sharing the recording as well in the post-event email. So make sure to follow us on socials and you'll know about upcoming events. So thank you so much again for joining. And thank you, Ari, for being with Illinois Answers today.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Illinois Answers. Thank you,
Everyone.
Alex. Y'all did great work. It was a pleasure to be here.